Photographic Composition, Lecture 6, Photojournalism, Part 1. Photojournalists are storytellers. Larry Burroughs was a photographer who came to prominence in the Vietnam War, was considered one of the finest of photographers working at the time. And his objective was to, in as few images as possible, sum up what was happening. He was killed in the line of action during the Vietnam War, but his images remain as testaments to the work that he did. Francis Frith, we've seen this photograph before, was a very early photojournalist. He engaged more in travel photography than actual photojournalism. He wasn't being hired by publications to cover events and places. Nonetheless, he was going and documenting architecture and places and in many instances as well as people, with the intention of letting people back home in Europe know what these places look like. This is quite typical of his work. He included people not only to show what the local culture looked like, but also to give this scene scale. Roger Fenton is credited as being the first war photographer. As you can see in this image, doesn't appear to be any actual combat going on because of the very slow process of making pictures at the time. This was made in the early 1850s. He was relegated to making images of either the aftermath of battles or portraits and group shots like this one of the soldiers engaged in the war. And you can see that this is a relatively long exposure because the horse guard in the background is actually moving. Keeping a horse still long enough apparently was not possible. So there's a fair amount of blur in that one character. Jacob Riis was a photojournalist. Actually, he was primarily a journalist. He was a writer who understood the power of photographs in telling a story. He worked in New York, and his objective in the 1880s was to bring about reform in housing in New York. As a result, he went out and photographed the various neighborhoods of New York that were crumbling, falling apart, and where conditions were really squalid. He would often go into very dangerous areas, such as this one, in pursuit of images, to let people who were reading the papers know that people were living in these conditions and they were unacceptable. He published them in a book called How the Other Half Lives. Ironically, although he was making these photographs with the intention of showing them, the newspapers were incapable of actually reproducing photographs at the time that these were made. And what the readers would actually see were drawings that were made from his original photographs. Arnel Ganthet was a California photographer based in San Francisco who had the presence of mind to cover events after the earthquake and fire in 1906. His fellow photographer, Carlton Watkins, lost a huge inventory of his work, thousands of glass negatives and other evidence of his work were destroyed in the earthquake and fire. And here you can see this is obviously before television or even radio. And this was the best show in town. I'm sure it was very scary for people living there, but it was also fascinating to watch. So you see here with these facades that have fallen off the fronts of buildings in the foreground, there are people who have actually brought out chairs and are watching the fire and other events as they're unfolding. Louis Hine was a reformer and a photographer, but primarily a photographer. And he made it his mission to document the conditions of workers and specifically of child laborers from around the turn of the century up through the 1930s. His photographs were actually instrumental in getting legislation passed outlawing child labor like this. Arthur Rothstein was one of a number of photographers hired by the Farm Security Administration in the 1930s to document conditions in the country at that time, including the Dust Bowl, which was wreaking havoc on the agricultural industry and at the same time making it very difficult for people to keep themselves fed. Russell Lee, who was also one of the FSA photographers, was also charged with documenting, documenting these conditions. And here we see this young boy who, is living in a house with a newspaper for wallpaper and very reduced circumstances. Weegee was for lack of a better term, a crime photographer. He was a freelance photojournalist who worked out of his car. He actually had a darkroom built into the trunk of his car. He had a police scanner, and he would go to scenes where some crime had been committed, or some event was going on. And in this case, these are a group of onlookers, a lot of them kids, who had shown up because someone in the neighborhood had been murdered or something else had happened, and so he turned his camera on them. In this case, these are some organized crime figures who didn't want themselves to be photographed, and their desire not to be photographed, of course, made for a much more compelling image as a result. Dorothea Lange, another of the Farm Security Administration photographers, and intent on showing conditions at the time, long lines of people waiting for scraps of food that were made available to them, and showing the character of the people who were on these lines and the desperation that they were feeling at the time. Walker Evans, also working for the Farm Security Administration, photographed people. He's primarily known for his architectural studies, but he did photograph a number of people. He accompanied James Agee, the writer, to Alabama and Mississippi, where they stayed with and interviewed a number of people living in rural poverty. And here are a couple of portraits of family members of the family that they were interviewing. Margaret Bourke-White was a magazine photographer. This is, in fact, the first cover of Life magazine. It is a dam, and as such, the subject matter was not at the time considered something that a woman would be interested in photographing, but it's a wonderful and powerful image, which the editors rightly saw as something worthy of their first cover. She also was engaged in covering poverty in the Depression. This was made in the 1930s, and just couldn't avoid the contrast between the people on the breadline and the people in the billboard behind them. In Europe, photographers were also covering events, but also everyday life. Henri Cartier-Bresson was one of the better known of photographers working at the time using small cameras, 35 millimeter, and showing everyday life, in this case in Spain, but also in his native France. And he was capable of he was able to get people beyond the fact that he was photographing them. He would blend into the landscape using small cameras that were not very obtrusive, certainly helped, but his manner was such that he had a way of fading into the background. People did not pay attention to him. They went on with their lives, and he documented them. Robert Capa was a war correspondent photographer, and also was killed in the line of action, although not this was made on D-Day in World War II. He would die several years later in Asia, covering another war. But his images have an immediacy to them. He wanted to put as little between the camera and the subject matter. This is also by Capa, of a woman who was considered a collaborator and being vilified by the people in her town. Again, the objective is to sum up as much of what is going on as possible within a single frame. W. Eugene Smith was considered the greatest of the magazine story photographers. He worked for Life and then Look magazine, and he worked in a serial manner, very often taking months to put together a story. He was hired to photograph during the Second World War and was very severely wounded, but until he was wounded, made many great photographs of soldiers and in various situations such as this. And after the war, he worked on a number of other stories, in this case about a country doctor. And also, this is taken from a series made in Pittsburgh, covering the steel workers. And here we see a portrait which reveals something of the specific person, but also the iconic character of the people who worked in big industry in the United States.